Thank you, everyone, for joining me week after week for these live internet studies. My name is Ariel Ben Lyman Hanavi. This is an hour-long study, and if you're listening to only the short 5-minute version of this video, just reminding you to catch all 5 parts of each of the segments. So 30-minute segments for each topic, 30 minutes for the Matthew 9:14 through 17 study, and then 30 minutes for the Exploring the Shema study. And then that way it makes up for one live show, 1 hour-long live show. Let's jump right into the first segment, which is the Matthew study. You can see on your screen right now, I've got Matthew 9:14 through 17 pulled up. ESV calls this a question about fasting. Let's read the relevant passage, and then we'll jump right into my notes. So, starting in verse 14, here's what we read. Quote, "Then the disciples of John came to him, saying, 'Why do we and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast?' Verse 15, "And Jesus said to them, 'Can the wedding guests mourn as long as the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast.' Verse 16, "No one puts a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment, for the patch tears away from the garment, and a worse tear is made." And verse 17, "Neither is new wine put into old wineskins. If it is, the skins burst, and the wine is spilled, and the skins are destroyed. But new wine is put into fresh wineskins, and so both are preserved." So that's the text we're working from. As I've already mentioned to you, this same story is found in Mark and in Luke. And in Luke's rendering, there's an extra segment to the parable at the very end about wine, where Yeshua reminds people that no one after drinking old wine desires new wine, for he says to himself, the old wine is, and depending on your version, it can say the old wine is better, or it can say the old wine is good. But it's kind of the same concept. All right, we've already talked about how the reason I'm having these studies is because common to historic Christianity is an interpretation of these passages in the allegorical sense of Jesus is answering this question about why aren't his disciples fasting, and he provides an answer kind of in a common sense fashion up front about why would you want to fast at a wedding, but then he kind of supports his answer with these 2 parables, one about the patching of clothing and the other about putting wine into wineskins. And what we've learned is that in the historic Christian model of interpretation, or method of interpretation, the allegorical one, that Christianity has chosen to interpret the Master's words as Jesus is bringing a change, out with the old, in with the new. And in that application, that allegory, the old is the Jewish way of life, the system of approaching God by keeping the commandments and bringing sacrifices and all of those other things, rituals of the law of Moses. That's the old. And what Jesus is bringing by way of new is this new way of walking out of our faith in God, which is basically walking by the power of the Spirit. All the traditional kind of ways of understanding that Christianity is to lead their lives as Christians, right? In, say, contradistinction to the Jewish way of life that was already laid down by Jesus' time. So when we have the parables put forth about the patch on the cloth, we notice there's some incompatibility between the 2 elements. The new patch and the old cloth are incompatible because one's going to shrink away or one's going to tear away. And so we see there's some incompatibility issues. Likewise, with the wine, we also notice the similar elements, although they're swapped now as far as which one needs to adjust. But it's the same general principle, is that there's some incompatibility between something that's new and something that's old. And thus, that's why Christianity has opted for the allegorical interpretation that they provide, which is there must be something that Jesus is trying to convey to those who are listening to him explain this. And the unfortunate part of this passage that we read is that no matter if you read it in Matthew, Mark, or Luke, Jesus doesn't explain his parable this time. Often he will. If you've read through the parables of Yeshua, you notice that's what he does. But this time he doesn't. No explanation. So Christianity is kind of forced, as it were, to supply their own explanation. Although, what we noticed is that there's a second way to understand these passages. That is to not opt for an allegorical, but simply to just stick to the kind of historical, common sense, everyday examples about fasting at a wedding, patching garments, and moving wine into new wineskins. And what we end up with are some common themes that are all related to common sense. Doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do, right? Just doing naturally what would be the preferred thing to do, the right thing, the right response, as it were, you might say. And so, using your thinking brain, would you fast at a wedding or would you feast and rejoice at a wedding, right? Well, most people would feast and rejoice. So Yeshua was trying to say, well, hey, look, I'm the bridegroom that God promised to send Israel, right? Israel's my bride. I'm the bridegroom. Here I am. Why do you want to mourn? Why do you want to fast, right? Let's rejoice. Okay, that makes sense, right? Let's get some wine out. Let's have fun. Likewise, in verse 16 of the Matthew rendering, you're going to patch up an old piece of garment, an old cloth. You get a new patch. You got to do some conditioning first, right? Because otherwise disaster is going to happen. So that's just common sense. And then again, with the wine and the wineskin, starting in verse 17, then again, common sense. And this would have been common sense to anyone, right? You don't have to be a scholar to figure this out in Yeshua's day, nor today, that if you're going to introduce these two elements, wine and wineskins, one's new and one's old, then you have to do some reconditioning. And in this case, it's the wineskins. So